So welcome everyone to our conversation at Graham. Um, and today's topic is on delving into Dickens with Claire Pearson. And I'm going to be doing a brief introduction. So let me just share my screen here for a moment. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. Let's see. Okay, yes. And I am not Seth Green. I'm Zoe Eisenman. Seth wasn't able to be here with us today. So I'm filling in for him. And I'm the Director of Academics at the Graham School. So I oversee the non-credit programs at the Graham School. And I'm very pleased to be able to join you today and to present Claire Pearson's talk. Just a brief overview of the college. Here's the campus on a nice sunny day. Not what it looks like right now, which is lovely in the snow, more like Brianna's background. But just wanted to go over a little bit about the Graham School for those of you who are not familiar. We are the Graham School, which is the gateway to the incredible ideas of this university for intellectually curious adults everywhere. And we are now 132 years into this mission, the first of its kind in our country, to extend the big ideas of this university to all learners and to really make sure that the cutting edge ideas that are here at the university are accessible to the world at large. And for those of you who are not familiar with Graham, we have 4 program areas. Our Master of Liberal Arts, which is one of the most rigorous and respected in the world, where you work across all divisions of the university. The basic program, where you're able to immerse yourself in the great books of Western social and political thought and literature in a classroom that is committed to the Socratic tradition. Our open enrollment program, where you can explore non-credit courses across all disciplines and experience the joy and camaraderie of learning with other students. And we also have annual programs that allow you to better know Chicago and even deepen your understanding of museum publishing. Our registration for winter courses is open now and will close December 29th at 5 p.m. Central Time. And you can find all our non-credit courses listed. I'll put the link to those in the chat in just a little bit. And in this season of giving, I would like to take this opportunity to thank our Graham School Circle members and our many friends for their ongoing support of our mission here at Graham. I think that is it. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And I will put our course link into the chat for you, as I said. And that. There. And then now I'm happy to introduce our speaker for today, Claire Pearson. Claire joined the basic program staff in 1997 after 10 years of undergraduate teaching at the University of Chicago and the Honors College at Valparaiso University. She did her undergraduate work as well as graduate work with the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago, where she worked on the intersections of literature and philosophy, with special attention to the interrelationship of literature and ethics. While in graduate school, she studied in Germany on a DAAD fellowship and then taught for 3 years in Germany in a study abroad program for American undergraduates. She has given papers and published articles on Martin Heidegger and lectures regularly for the basic program. In addition to her work in higher education, she also spent a year as lead teacher and acting principal at a Chicago area alternative high school. From 2004 to 2008, she chaired the basic program and co-designed the Asian Classics program, which she also chaired from 2006 to early 2009. She is the 2008 recipient of the Graham School Excellence in Teaching Award for the basic program. And in addition to her classes at the basic program, currently teaches in the Humanities and Philosophy Department at Oakton Community College. And this winter, Claire will be teaching a course titled Charles Dickens, A Tale of Two Cities, Oliver Twist, and Hard Times. And today's conversation is going to focus on Dickens and these 3 texts. And I put the link to that course in the chat for you guys. So Claire, I'm going to go ahead and spotlight you also here. There we go. And just start off with a couple of general questions. And first of all, by talking about Dickens the person. So who is Charles Dickens, and what were some of the big issues in society in England that were being wrestled with in his time? And who were some of the thought leaders in his time?
Okay. I think most people have some awareness of Charles Dickens. It's hard not to be aware of Dickens. Dickens was the single most popular writer in the first half of the 19th century in Britain. He lived in London. This season, probably a lot of you are seeing various versions of A Christmas Carol popping up, which of course is one of his stories. He's known both for his satire. Well, maybe satire takes care of both of these. He's known for being a comic writer and known for being really very much the social conscience of early 19th century England. And when I say early, we're going into, up through 1860. And he's a little different in a lot of ways in terms of his past from so many of the better known English not better known than him, I mean, better known in general, well-known English novelists of the 19th century, because most of them came from the gentry. And Dickens his family was a professional class family. A professional class family that failed badly financially when he was a child. And so Dickens had this interesting combination of experiences shifting from the middle to the lower class and back up to the middle class. He was very marked by that. Those of you who have read David Copperfield, which is a significantly semi-autobiographical story. If you remember the figure of Mr. Micawber is actually significantly based on Dickens' father. And Mr. Micawber, if you remember, is, a genial, well-meaning, foolish, financially incompetent man. And that's a good description for Dickens' father. He couldn't manage his own household. He couldn't manage his own finances. When Dickens was 12, he ended up in debtor's prison. And Dickens, as a result, had to go to work as a child laborer in factories for 2 years, trying to get his father out of debtor's prison. His mother, unfortunately, when they finally managed to get his father out, thought he should continue to work there and support the family. But he did manage to get back to school, but only for a year. But at this point in time, child labor laws were horrendous. Something like 84% of people who worked in not all the factories, but in mill work at least, were between the ages of 11 and 18.
Oh man.
Yeah. Yeah. And there were a number of reform bills, the first of which generously limited the working day for children between 6 and 11 to 11 hours a day.
Oh, geez.
And later on, they required kids who were under 11 to be able to have alternate school days. And they cut their work hours to the point where they were not allowed to work at night. But this was still, I mean, this was the development of the earliest sweatshop in the world. And these grew up very, very quickly when England started to industrialize. And while there were all kinds of people doing this sweatshop labor, in a lot of the factories, it was dominated by women and children. And so Dickens grew up with a lifelong passion for the idea of public schooling guaranteed to all children, the need to protect poor children, to give them some kind of a decent opportunity and decent upbringing, and in general, a concern for the laboring poor. And all of this comes through. I don't think he has a novel that does not tackle these things in some way, on various levels. He was an interesting man in that when he was 14 when he managed to get out of factory work and back to school, but only for a year. And he did a number of things. He became a law clerk, and started to learn the practice of law. And then he moved into legal journalism. And this only increased his interest in social and political justice, because he became aware firsthand of the horrors of the English legal system at that time, and the huge injustices and the amount of corruption that there was. He worked for a while on if these aren't entirely contradictory, they are in some ways contradictory, a liberal Benthamite journal. He was not himself a Benthamite, not a fan of Bentham, because Bentham really gets twisted as a tool of the conservative movement and laissez-faire economics. But he knew quite a lot of political philosophy and of political economy, from working for a number of years on that journal and working in the law courts. And it was once said that there was never an activist meeting in his vicinity that he was not a speaker at. So he was very much the social activist. He was also ranked the most popular after dinner speaker in England, not surprisingly. He considered at one point doing a stint as an actor, and as he got more popular in his writing, he actually did a regular series of promotions where he would go out and get a couple of actors with him, and he would perform scenes from his books. And these were incredibly popular, and he apparently just loved doing it. So I said to Seth at one point, if Dickens were alive today, he'd be doing miniseries for Netflix or HBO. I think that would be his natural medium, because he's a theater man at heart in a lot of ways. Let's see, what else do you want to know? I'll let you.
No, I mean, it's a really fascinating backstory. I mean, the impact of that. I mean, maybe you can talk a little bit about how that upbringing and that those, where social, challenges play into the novels that you're going to be talking about in the class. I know certainly Oliver Twist, you can sort of see the connection there, but maybe talk a little bit about each of the ones that you're going to be discussing.
Sure. Oliver Twist is one of his earliest novels, and not surprising, because he is focused on the issue of, Oliver Twist is a child who's born into the workhouse, so he gets to treat the workhouse to some degree. He gets to treat the lack of education that's given. He gets to treat, he's apprenticed, but he's preyed upon at the same time. And most people know at least the framework of the Oliver Twist story, because in the Disney version and in the Broadway version, it became so popular. Never trust Broadway versions or Disney versions, by the way, but I expect everybody knows that. He ends up as a street urchin. And actually, that was one of my motivations for doing this. Some of you know that last summer I taught Hugo's masterwork, Les Miserables, and the street urchins in Paris, the gamins, make up such an important part of that story, and he devotes a chapter to them where he even makes the argument that is different from in England. And that sparked for me a desire to come back to Dickens and to start looking at what Dickens was doing with this. And so Oliver Twist gives us Dickens' perspective on what it's like to be on the street in England, although only one perspective among others, because he spends a little bit of time on the street in Copperfield as well. And it's, it's as you might expect, an ugly experience. There are plenty of villains out there. I thought that the logical place to tie this together would be through the work that he is doing around the French Revolution later on. So A Tale of Two Cities, which is one of my absolute favorites and is often considered his best book, is, it's going to be the starting point of the class. It's a late novel, so we're not going to go in historical order in terms of the writing, but it is in historical order in terms of the times that are being presented. So A Tale of Two Cities came out of Dickens' both sympathy for what the poor were going through in Paris and his understanding of the roots of the revolution, and yet his concerns for the violence and the possibilities that, England could very possibly experience something of the same kind. And so he turns to Paris to explore it, but it's a back and forth between England and Paris, because we start with the daughter of a French aristocrat who, prior to the revolution, has been falsely accused and is in the Bastille. And we're back and forth with aristocrats who justify the uprising and what gets done to them in many respects, versus, aristocrats who don't have any part in that and who are getting caught up in the violence despite their own personal qualities. And our link is an English bank. I don't think the bank is chosen casually. So we do some interesting things going back and forth with respect to what goes on in England. And then we're going to move from there to Oliver Twist and take a look at that. And then we move back to another late novel, which is Hard Times, which is probably his most satirical novel. And it was one that really upset a lot of his critics who were on the more conservative side, because in Hard Times, he goes to a fictitious town named Coketown. And this is a hard-hitting satirical look at Adam Smith gone awry in a certain sense, at the, the growth of the early industrial age, with the ideas of rational self-interest, of the invisible hand, of the idea that what becomes of workers when you put them into an unregulated capitalist system. And he does there's some really biting satire in there. He does some of it quite nicely, but he's not shy about what he says there. So there are also some wonderful characters. It's a very mature work. It has a lot of nuance. We follow, in particular, a young woman who was raised on the model of teach only facts, discourage any kind of fantasy or imagination, teach rational self-interest. And we see what it does to her life. And we balance that off with a workman who gets caught up in the factory because he recognizes they're trying to unionize. There's a move to unionize, and he recognizes both the needs to unionize and some of the problems that are going to come out personally for him with it. So he becomes the one who stands against both sides, which is problematic. So Dickens is getting into the treatment of the poor, the treatment of poor children, the lack of education, the rise of industrial sweatshops, the rise of the union movement. And interestingly enough, after the French Revolution and then the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had already made itself such an international manufacturing country through its early industrialization that they were very hurt financially by the drying up of the European market for their machines. And there were serious uprisings going on in the 20s and 30s in the English countryside, where this was the birth of the Luddites, who were going around and smashing machines because the machines had taken their jobs and there was nothing left to replace them. So the social unrest informs all of these works, I think.
Yeah, wow. Pretty amazing.
It's fascinating stuff. Historically, it's an interesting period, and who better to look at it with than Dickens, I think.
Mhm. Do you feel like, could you tell us a little bit about how these novels influenced his time? I mean, did these produce change in thinking in England or elsewhere?
I think that they were influential. There were gradual reforms, but I don't think that we can credit any particular reforms to Dickens. He was a voice of conscience there. The reforms happened slowly. And, you know, I was describing, I think, the this was before we were on camera, isn't it? When I was describing the child labor laws. Yes. Was that before we were on camera?
I think, no, you started off with that.
Okay, with the child labor laws. Yeah. 82% of the mill workers were children between 11 and 18. The reforms granted them an 11-hour workday. We've got all of this crazy stuff. You know, if a reform is an 11-hour workday for children, what's pre-reform?
Yeah.
So he pushed really hard on issues in particular for children's education and the nature of children's education, because the schools that were available to poor children were often quite abusive.
I think I'm actually going to start going to some of the questions in the chat because these are really pretty
Mhm.
interesting.
Great.
So Susan Yohe says, can you put Dickens in the context of other writers and thinkers of his era? Was Trollope and Eliot writing at this time? Who else? Who are the major thinkers that perhaps we've read in the basic program?
Most of the writers, the English writers that we read, come a little bit later than Dickens. There's some overlap with Austen, but she's inhabiting such a different world. Eliot, you know, Do they overlap at the tail end of Dickens? Yes, probably. Eliot's inhabiting a different world as well. She has her issues, but and she's not unconcerned with the poor. She does have some novels that really dig into the conditions for at least poor agricultural people. And she has a novel on one of the reforms that was going on in the 1850s in terms of political reforms that did not go particularly well. And it took England a long time to spread the vote out beyond the aristocracy. I think in his concerns, he's closer to Hugo. I reach out to France. I think Dostoevsky shares some of the same concerns with him. I haven't seen a lot of English novels from that time that really vie with Dickens or that resonate with him so much.
That's interesting. Well, I'm going to go down to the next question because we've got a lot of questions coming in now. Greg Gosek says, Dickens visited the US twice for lecture tours, including a side trip to the Illinois Prairie. Which Americans was he closest to, and how did his views of the US evolve over his life?
He was appalled at the US. I haven't really dug in deeply to his time in America. I'm using the Norton Anthology editions for all of these novels, and one of them has a piece of his writing from a Philadelphia factory. He was in general rather disappointed that the US didn't do better than it did in terms of these issues. He expected more, I think. So he nonetheless did, he did want to do some travel in the US. He did want to do some promotions for his novels in the US. And when I say promotion, I mean acting out. And on the one hand, it's promotion. On the other hand, I think it was his entertainment for himself. Because he clearly just enjoyed performance so much. And the US became quite a good market for him. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we lived up to his hopes in terms of social justice for the poor and working conditions in factories.
Interesting. Well, let's see. Beata says, could you please discuss Dickens' view of women in different social classes?
That's an interesting one. I have to confess, Dickens has a lot of different kinds of women in his writing. He's not Eliot, he's not Thomas Hardy, what we get at the end of the century with really challenging the norms, but we clearly see a number of smart, independent women, as well as we see a number of real caricatures. And I go back to David Copperfield for a moment with his first wife Dora, who is sweet and foolish and doesn't have a lot upstairs, but again, she was drawn from his life. She's contrasted with a couple of very sharp and savvy women, one of whom is his aunt, who is also has been deeply victimized, and I think is a very interesting character, and is a somewhat comic character despite the victimization. But I would say overall he has a healthy respect for women. And he's hard to pigeonhole on women, which is something I very much like. We wouldn't want him to be easy to pigeonhole.
Certainly true. Well, let's see. Dennis Callanan asks, can you comment on the names that Dickens used for his characters?
Nice question. In terms of sort of ethical and literary philosophy, Dickens was very troubled at the sort of early romantic tradition of glamorizing the anti-hero. It very much bothered him. And one of the things that we see is that both that we will find in his book, we will find people who screw up but can be a lot better, and we will find some hard villains that he's sometimes accused of caricaturing a little bit too much. He tends to name them with names that are somewhat comic, or with names that echo certain negative characteristics of the person. In Oliver Twist, one character who is problematic there is Fagin, and the name Fagin doesn't evoke anything really. Fagin supposedly is drawn from real life, drawn by from an actual character, but who do we get? Let me think of some of the names that that we have coming up here. And of course, when I want to think of of interesting names all at once, they're not springing to mind. Gradgrind is the first person we will meet in Hard Times. Mr. Gradgrind is the head teacher at the local school, and the one whose philosophy is facts, facts, facts. You must only teach them facts. You must root out anything that is not a fact. And yes, that's an example of playing with the name there. Gradgrind is fairly caricatured as a character, but he's not one of the main characters either. He's the father of one of the main characters who suffers from him.
Now, let's see. Well, George William asks, I know you're not covering this novel, but given the time of year, can you comment on A Christmas Carol? It appears to have similar themes.
Oh, I love A Christmas Carol. And my favorite version of it, by the way, is the Muppet version of it, which is hilarious if you haven't watched it. It does have similar themes, and it's rather nice that he allows Scrooge to be reformable. But A Christmas Carol is something of a short morality play, a really well done morality play, but very much a morality play. And I think it's so telling that we're still making new versions of it now and still watching it. And it's been almost 200 years. It says a lot for Dickens.
Oh, you got a shout out for Michael Caine as Scrooge in the Muppet version in the chat.
Yes, he's wonderful. He's absolutely wonderful.
All right, let's see. Bill Chamberlain says, apart from Dickens as a reformer, what are the keys to his writing or his style?
He is what I would call serious comedic. He is always animated by a deep humanity and a deep concern for social justice, but he achieves this through a combination of creating some very human, very likable characters, and then satirizing many of the people who stand in their way. Uh, Now, that said, A Tale of Two Cities has been called the least Dickensian of Dickens novels. And what I take that to mean is that we're not in that particular novel. He's concerned about the issues so much that they're developed with quite a bit of nuance, and he resists the tendency toward very strong satire in A Tale of Two Cities. So there's, he has quite a range, and often more range than he's often given credit for.
Well, perhaps this next question sort of ties into that. Tom Irvin says, can you talk about how Dickens used coincidence in his stories? In your opinion, does he overuse this literary device?
I don't think he does overuse coincidence. And it's funny how often this comes up for various authors. I have people asking this of Dostoevsky. I had people asking it of Hugo. I personally am a believer that coincidences happen. Things that you don't expect, things that are extremely unlikely, can happen all the time. So as long as they don't totally strain credulity, I don't see a problem with it. And I cannot think of a single example in a Dickens novel where I said, oh, that would never happen. So, and maybe it's just that I'm a little more tolerant of that than some. I once met a man from Rome. This was when I married my first husband, and we were waiting at the train station on our honeymoon, and the train was delayed, and we had a long conversation with a man from Rome. Never saw him again for years. We were in Florence many years later at the Florence train station, and there he was. And he remembered us. And we sat down and had lunch with him. How many people are in the world? What's the likelihood of that? Neither of us was in our own city. So, I will defend coincidence to the end.
Well, we have a comment from Helen. She says, isn't coincidence, including that which strains credulity, common in Victorian novels, for example, Jane Eyre? So do you feel like it's sort of a typical device from this time period?
I think that a realistic novel is not going to shut coincidence out. I do think that modern novels, we have less tolerance for it, but I'm not sure that we necessarily should. I'm just not convinced of that. Sorry.
Fair enough. Let's see. Bray Corin asks, could you say something about Dickens' use of the grotesques? That's one of my favorite aspects of his work.
Oh, yeah. We find the grotesque in some of his sharpest villains. And what can we say? He is a believer that people are largely decent on the whole, but he is also a believer, along with Aristotle and Confucianism, I would say, that it's possible to destroy your own humanity or have your own humanity destroyed. And the characters who have lost touch with anything like their humanity become quite grotesque. He draws them explicitly to show people who aren't quite human. And I think he does it well, although again, if you have a thoroughly modern realistic sensibility, it might bother you. He's doing it for his own purposes, and I think he has a philosophical and literary justification in mind every time he does. But I'm with Bray. It's fun.
Well, let's see. Ben asks, are there some things shared between Dickens and Karl Marx?
Well, Marx is a very interesting and very nuanced writer. I'm sure that there are some things shared between Dickens and Karl Marx, because Marx was very concerned with what was happening with factory workers in Germany, and he was concerned with the exploitation of the worker. He was concerned with the loss of humanity in industrial factory work, so that workers who are working 11 hours a day, 6, sometimes 7 days a week, have no room to educate themselves. They have no room for anything except work. And to that extent, I mean, one of the major characters in Hard Times talks about this. He tries to stay out of the politics of it, but the factory owner comes and pushes him to talk about the strike and why they're striking. And he says just this. He says, you think we're not even human beings. We're just pieces of the machine. And we're not able to be human anymore. We have no time, we have no energy, we have no money to be human. We just keep ourselves alive and work. And you could say that that's something that Marx has said, and it's an overlapping concern. I would definitely say that doesn't make Dickens anywhere near a Marxist either, though. He's a long way from a Marxist. He's concerned about the potential for all structural organizations to become abusive. And this even includes, when we see the union leader in Hard Times, it even includes, yes, these workers have to have some rights, something's got to be done, but the union leader himself is manipulating them. So we see a situation which is leaving very little in the way of a good choice.
No, that's really interesting. Bill Chamberlain on this says Dickens and Shaw might be a good comparison.
On that, yeah. But Shaw was he was a socialist, so he's certainly not going to simply overlap Dickens, but I once took a class called Political Plays and Prefaces of George Bernard Shaw, and I will say the prefaces were really something. The plays are great, read the prefaces. I don't know that Dickens would completely overlap with him, but they are both dealing with the same kind of problem and trying to approach it from an issue of humanity.
Well, for our last question, I'm going to sort of combine two. We had two questions about the way in which the novels were published and written. So Stacy was asking, were these novels published serialized like Great Expectations? And then Ira Pulchin mentioned that it makes sense to me that Tale of Two Cities is considered the least Dickensian of his works. I found it much tighter, thematically focused, and sharper written than, say, Great Expectations, which seems to illustrate what Dickens was known for as a writer, being paid by the word. So those ideas of the serialization and getting paid by the word, are those, how would you contextualize those things?
Dickens serialized most of his novels. That was the way that many great writers published in those days, certainly not all of the great writers. But I don't know that we necessarily need to associate serialization with being paid by the word. In some of the earlier novels, it's probably going to feel a little more like that, because I mean, he was literally writing for his life at that point in time. And and he did not in the early novels, and Oliver Twist would fall into this category, though neither of the other two would. He did not have a lot of time for extensive editing. You know, he's pushed, and he ran around and did all kinds of things. He always had a lot of plates in the air. So he also had, I should mention, 9 surviving children. And he was known, at least before they hit their teenage years, he was known for being a very engaged father in their upbringing. So yeah, as a young man, he had a lot on his plate.
Well, I guess that's a very strong incentive to want to get paid by the word.
Yeah, I don't see him as simply throwing words in there to make extra money, but I do think in the early days, he would have been grateful for a week to sit down and edit something, which he typically didn't have.
Well,
The mistress came later, Helen.
I was going to say there's a lot of dependence going on there.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Well, we are pretty much at the end of our time, but I did want to just say thank you, Claire, for talking about these very fascinating novels and for telling us a little bit about Charles Dickens and his world. I did put the title and the link to the class in the chat, so if anybody's interested in Claire's class, the class does start in January and registration is open until December 29th, so there's still time to register. But yeah, thank you, Claire, for such a wonderful discussion and very interesting topic. So
thank you for letting me talk about Dickens. I love him personally.
well, and thank you all for coming and for listening, and we hope to see you again soon.
Have a wonderful holiday, everybody.
Happy holidays, everyone. Take care.